Greetings. My name is Margaret Heisel, and I am the moderator of today's webinar. I welcome you to the University of California, Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education webinar on the subject of Pursuing Institutions of Excellence, Lessons from the Field. The presentation today will study universities in 7 different national and economic environments, illustrating how these universities set their goals and define their missions and values. And the speakers will then explore how universities abroad align their policies and practices, their daily policies and practices, with their goals. These descriptions will illustrate how different universities define excellence and how they seek to achieve it. Clearly, this is information that is very useful to governors of universities everywhere. Our 2 speakers have developed extraordinarily deep and broad knowledge of this subject over the years. We will hear first from Matthew Hartley, Professor of Education and Board of Advisors Chair of Education at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. He's also the founding executive director of the Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy at Penn, and has many, many other posts and achievements. Our second speaker is Alan Ruby. Alan has a very, very long career in government, business, philanthropy, and education, ranging all the way from faculty posts to being Australia's Deputy Secretary of Education, and his being, this is really significant, the chair of the OECD Education Committee. As you undoubtedly know, OECD involves 37 different countries, so having that post is really important. Now, both of our speakers also serve as university trustees, and they have gained the highest level of knowledge of both governance of higher education and international higher education. Now, after we hear from these 2 speakers, they will respond. Oh, wait a minute. Both of our speakers also serve as university trustees, which I think is very important, and thus have gained even more knowledge of governance of higher education. After we hear from the 2 speakers, they will respond to questions that many of you posted when you registered for this webinar, and also questions that all of you today may pose in the chat function of your screen as you are listening. Well, thank you again for joining us. And now I am turning to our first speaker, Matthew Hartley. Matthew?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Margaret. And we are so delighted to be here. And Alan and I would like to begin by thanking Margaret and George for inviting us to join you today and share some of our research. Over the next 25 minutes or so, Alan and I are going to provide an overview of a research project that we began about 5 years ago and are close to summing up in a book for Cambridge University Press. And this project grew out of conversations we were having about some of the countries where we were doing work. And what we saw were huge investments being made in efforts to create, quote, world-class universities, unquote, which usually was defined in terms of wanting to be in the top 50 of some international rankings, often in an incredibly short time period. And world-class universities, of course, do remarkable work, and they're very prestigious, which is one of the reasons why policymakers like them as an aspirational goal, but they also require immense resources. And these conversations led Alan and me to begin thinking about institutions that we knew of in a variety of contexts who, from our perspective, are doing really deeply impactful work. None of them are household names. None of them are going to appear in the top 50 of any international world rankings, but we felt that these institutions have a lot to teach us about alternative conceptions of excellence. And we also hope that these profiles might encourage policymakers to broaden the conception of institutions that are worthy of public support. The book that we're finishing now profiles 8 institutions. These are places where Alan and I know people at each of these institutions, and we have visited almost all of them. We had hoped to visit all of them, but unfortunately the pandemic intruded. But they are Asian University for Women in Bangladesh, Dublin City University in Ireland, Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, Pontificia Universidad Católica in Chile, the School of Advanced Studies, which is a college within the University of Tumin in Russia, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in India, and the University of Maryland, Baltimore County in the United States, and the University of Qatar in Doha, Qatar. One of these, the things that we think that these cases powerfully illustrate is that what produces excellence is intentionality and clarity of purpose. And it comes from colleagues asking themselves, what work are we trying to do in the world? Who do we exist to serve? What problems in the world are calling on us to reimagine our work in order to address them? And each of these institutions, we feel, has compelling answers to those questions. And they underscore how limited rankings are for judging success and how problematic the pursuit of prestige can be. So today we're going to focus on one institution, and it's the institution, the only institution in our book that's from the U.S., University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And we think it offers a particularly rich example of some of the characteristics and features that we find across these institutions. University of Maryland, Baltimore County is a public university in a suburb near Baltimore. The institution has about 13,000 students, but if you visit the campus, it very much has the feeling of a tight-knit community. The campus contains 40 buildings, and they're the original 3 that were constructed in 1966, alongside some state-of-the-art LEED certified more recent buildings. And when we visited, the campus had yellow banners everywhere that read, "Welcome to our community of inquiring minds." And it's the kind of place where students, faculty, and staff stop and say hello and hold the doors for one another. UMBC opened in 1966. It's the 12th university in Maryland's public higher education system, and the first open to students of all races from its founding. The university was created to support the growing scientific industries in Maryland, and also to serve the needs of an increasingly diverse population, including many first-generation commuter students. Now, there were some fairly significant challenges in the early years. There were threats of closure by the legislature due to slowing regional enrollments. There were significant problems with graduation rates. There was high leadership turnover. But the university weathered these things, and in many ways, the legacy of UMBC as an institution is maybe best summed up in the motto that it used to celebrate its 50th anniversary, which is grit and greatness. Now, the 1980s brought something of an inflection point for the institution. The UMBC's 6-year graduation rate had dropped to 35% for undergraduates and was even lower for African-American students. And President Michael Herku reached out to Dr. Freeman Hrabowski, who was a mathematics professor and vice president of academic affairs at Coppin State University, which is a historically Black university in the Maryland system. And they met and talked. And in that talk, Hrabowski made clear that he was not interested in just being only an administrator. He really saw himself as a scholar and an academic, but he also believed in student success. And he felt this ought to be done using an empirical approach. If we face challenges on our campuses, they need to be investigated, understood, and then acted upon. And ultimately, Hooker managed to convince Hrabowski to take on the role of vice provost for undergraduate experience. And early on, Hrabowski framed his work in terms of empirical research, and in terms of an empirical research question, which is, what would it take for a predominantly white university to educate large numbers of students of color in STEM? And one of the earliest efforts in 1988 was the launch of the Meyerhoff Scholars Program. And this was launched with $500,000 startup funds from local philanthropists Robert and Jane Meyerhoff. And the idea was to admit a small cohort of very talented African-American students interested in STEM and to provide them with financial and academic support during their undergraduate studies at UMBC, and through this to develop a deeper understanding and a learning model that would enable historically marginalized students, and by extension, all students realize successful careers in STEM. The Meyerhoff Scholars Program challenged many of the paradigms about rigor and success that were implicit in STEM education at UMBC at the time. So instead of a system of weeding out less talented, quote unquote, students, Hrabowski advocated for a model where the success of all students was the aim. As one senior administrator we talked to put it, developing a sense of, what we wanted to do was develop a sense of community where, as Freeman says, look to your left, look to your right. If one of you isn't there, we've failed. So instead of framing race-based student achievement at UMBC as the product of individual students' performance or their dedication, Meyerhoff focused on implementing the structural changes and the programmatic and cultural changes at UMBC so that it created the environment where students could succeed. Another purpose of the program was to disrupt biases that many UMBC faculty had at the time, that many students, and particularly students of color, were not cut out for success in the STEM fields. And some faculty opposed the program, feeling like those resources should be used in other ways. And Hrabowski said, I thought that we scientists believed in waiting to draw conclusions until we have the evidence. And his empirical approach really struck a chord with the faculty. And he continued to take this approach throughout the development of the program, documenting the work and ultimately publishing several articles on the model. In 1993, President Hooker left and Hrabowski became the president of UMBC. And that same year, the first class of Meyerhoff scholars graduated, and the results of the initiative were really a powerful vindication of his original vision. The scholars found jobs in research. Many were admitted to the top STEM doctoral programs in the country. The Meyerhoff program established a model of organizational innovation that President Hrabowski and his senior team then began to replicate. So they would identify a critical issue to be addressed, frame a researchable question, design an intervention, garner financial and community support, implement the program, measure its impact, and learn and adjust. And people also came to understand that there were no negative consequences if an experiment didn't work. So as one senior vice president put it, with these experiments, there is no failure as long as you've learned something. And this approach became part of UMBC's institutional culture. And it was taken up at the departmental level too. So for example, when undergraduate chemistry failure rates rose in the early 2000s, the department examined its pedagogical models, developed a new pedagogical approach called discovery learning, which is a team-based approach to learning, and created a new chemistry discovery center to support this approach in 2005. And these changes cut the chemistry failure rate in half. Over the nearly 3 decades that Hrabowski served as president, these successes continued. And an institutional culture was developed that Hrabowski and co-authors called in their 2019 book, The Empowered University, which meant creating an institution where people across the institution were able to look honestly at what was going on and be empowered to act to change it for the better. And UMBC became known for drawing academically talented and also unconventional students. The vice president for enrollment put it this way: our students tend to be quirky and unapologetically quirky. They are okay with being different, and I think it's that sense of self and the fact that you're at a place that welcomes and embraces who you are for whatever you are that makes the difference. Or as Hrabowski puts it, we like being a nerdy place. In a 2011 segment for 60 Minutes about UMBC, a student interviewed said, "Let me be honest with you, when I came here, I thought this was the most boring place I'd ever been. But it hit me after one semester that the party at UMBC is in the library." One of the university's hallmarks has been its collegiate chess team. which has won 10 national and international championships over a couple of decades. And it's a real point of pride. When UMBC's men's basketball team beat the #1 seeded University of Virginia basketball team in March Madness in 2018, it was a huge upset and brought incredible national attention to UMBC. And in an interview with the team after the win on national TV, one player was asked, well, what are you going to do now? And he said, I got to go back to my room and study for a test. Another teammate said, we stand on the shoulders of our chess team. And when asked by a reporter if he was proud of his team, Hrabowski said, I'm proud that all 5 starters are on the dean's list. A number of factors have contributed to UMBC's success, and perhaps one of the most important is a governance process that's open, transparent, and collaborative. So rather than protecting turf, the team identifies key priorities, allocates resources from various areas to try to address them. UMBC's senior leadership team consists of the president, provost, vice presidents, and the deans of the colleges. Each of them that we talked about this the collaborative nature of their work. One vice president said, we've worked very hard over the years to develop a shared vision for what we want to do and to rise above our unit priorities, to think about the institution as a whole. It doesn't mean we don't disagree. We do, but I always feel like everybody's pulling in the same direction. There's a strong belief by the senior leadership team that working collectively produces better solutions. The provost, who was educated at Oxford, put it this way. He said, I have a relatively clever brain, but that's nothing compared to the sort of intellectual horsepower that you have in a university with hundreds and thousands of people that are really smart. And you'd be really stupid if you believed that your one brain could solve everything. And this is the great thing about universities. You have the ability to harness the entire intellectual power of the community. A second factor that we think has influenced the success is the continuity of leaders. A majority of the senior leadership team have been at UMBC for over 15 years, and they are deeply committed to the institution and its purpose. And of course, the most powerful constant has been the influence of Freeman Hrabowski, who served as president for 30 years from 92 until 22. And when we were gathering data in 21, most of UMBC's vice presidents and deans who had been at the institution for decades had known no other leader. There's a shared recognition of how special this is, especially given the average presidential tenure is about 6.5 years. Although Hrabowski talked about UMBC's success as a collective effort, his impact on the culture and the institution is really undeniable. And as one vice president described it, you can feel it. You walk in and the students are kind and the faculty are kind and the administration and faculty get along. It's a wonderful place to be and a very genuine place because Freeman is genuine. He's a visionary leader. He's humble, but he's charismatic. You always feel better leaving than you did coming, and he sets the tone. This is his body of work. Today, UMBC is recognized as a national leader in undergraduate teaching and a pipeline for scholars of color, particularly in the STEM fields. It is the national leader in graduating Black undergraduates who go on to complete an MD, PhD degree. And it is a top producer of talent for the intelligence community. In 2021, the university enrolled almost 2,100 first-year undergraduates, which was the most in its history. And in 22, it was granted Research 1 status by the Carnegie classification of institutions, which is, as we all know, is a competitive designation recognizing higher education institutions with very high research activity. And hundreds of new businesses and thousands of jobs have come out of its research and technology park. And UMBC consistently ranks among the great colleges to work for by the Chronicle of Higher Education. All that said, there is still more work to do. There continues to be a pattern of attrition of about 12% of students in the first year and 10 to 12 in the second year, with close to 25% of students gone by the end of their sophomore year, many transferring to other institutions. And also simultaneously, UMBC works with a large transfer student population of students coming in, and some of them have struggled with timely graduation. During his tenure, Hrabowski brought UMBC's endowment up to $105 million. However, people worry about whether UMBC can remain affordable and a place of excellence. And it's still very reliant on tuition. And as one administrator put it, it's still not a place financially where we can say everyone who comes from a family with $80,000 in income or less can go for free.
Oh, my.
There's a temptation to apply the same Cinderella story that framing to UMBC that was applied to the basketball team when they beat the University of Virginia. But this would really be a tremendous oversimplification of what went into creating the institution as it is today. We think that a more fitting metaphor might be a coming of age story. It took time, the right leadership for the university to come into its own, to mature, to realize its own unique vision and identity, and define excellence in its own terms. And in our view, the case really illustrates the importance of consistent leadership, the cultivation of a collective vision of success, and the development of institutional culture based on mutual trust and dedication to innovation and equity. It's a case that challenges our thinking about the possibilities of public higher education. And Alan, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. You hit a lot of the high points of what we've seen across the cases. And Matt mentioned 8 cases. We've looked at a lot more than 8 places to produce these cases. We're just going to concentrate on the 8 that are probably going to make it into the book. And the first thing that we do find across the cases is that there is that continuity and communication count. And Matt talked about the continuity of the leadership at UMBC. And we see the same continuity of leadership in other places that we've looked at. If you look at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai in India, it's been around since the 1930s and has had relatively few presidents, vice chancellors, rectors, whatever you want to call them. And sometimes this encourages you to think that you need to have the one person continue to be the leadership. And that's helpful, but in all of these cases, it's not just the continuity of leadership that matters, it's the continuity of the leadership team. So when you look at UMBC, a lot of the people who have created the institution served in various roles in the institution for quite a long time. And so there was a continuity of purpose and a continuity of the culture and the continuity of the vision. And it's that continuity that gets captured in this continuity of leadership. The second thing about that continuity is that it allows you to have a consistent message about what the institution stands for and what other defining values and purposes of the institution. Now, and if you read through the transcripts of the interviews with the people at UMBC and at many of the other institutions, you'll see recurring messages or stories about key decisions or key events or key trade-offs that they made to choose the path that they're on. And it's quite interesting. And Matt is a very skilled interviewer. So he is very clever, and it's clear that they're not singing from something that's been prearranged. The story's essentially the same, but it's always a little different. So you know that there's some authenticity about it. But the point that is there that they're all talking about the same value set. They're all talking about the same piece of what he talked about as the intentionality of purpose that these institutions have. And you see that that's important. Where it's also important is that it allows them to communicate what the institution stands for, not just to their faculty and staff, but to the students they wish to attract. This is what we care about. This is what we stand for. If you want to make a difference in STEM, you want to make a difference in rural poverty, you come to us because that's what we do. That's our purpose. And that's what's going to be our purpose for a long time. So that is why communication and continuity of message count. So you've got continuity of purpose, continuity of leadership, continuity of vision, and a consistency in communication about what you stand for. And that's what we try and capture with this little phrase of continuity and communication count. And that's been consistent across pretty much all of the cases that we've been studying. So if we come now to the second thing that we've learned, and I've drawn out the leadership teams and the consistency of purpose, but there's also a degree of certainty. There's a predictability that this mission or this vision isn't going to change very quickly, that we're going to stay the course. And Matt referred to the grit that is a mark of UMBC's culture. But it's also when you look at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, they have been consistent in insisting that all of its students have experience in the field. And this is an institution that began as preparing social workers, when social work was best described as a helping profession. And they kept that focus on field work, having students experience the realities of rural and urban poverty, what it's like to have no clean water and not to be able to feed your children. But it also says it's not just an immersion, it's not tourism. It was, you will go and learn and you will work on how to address the underlying problems of the lack of clean water and the lack of child malnutrition, and the lack of food that produces child malnutrition. You were going to take those problems and study them systematically, both in the field and in the classroom. But you're going to, when I talk about certainty, that has been a hallmark of the Tata Institute for now 70 years. And that's what I mean we talk about when we talk about certainty. And so there's a certainty of purpose, there's a certainty of the pedagogical approach, and there's a certainty about what the institution stands for. That there's not a lot of volatility in what these institutions do. So we can go then to the next message. We talk a little bit about the cases that we sometimes talk about them as portraits, images of great schools or of good schools, of places that have what we say a clear and compelling story, a narrative. And this is, those of you who are scholars of US higher education might be familiar with Burton Clark's book on the sagas, where he uses the sagas of three institutions to study their culture and the values and the key turning points in their decision making. Matt referred to the first graduating class of Meyerhoff scholars at UMBC. The fact that those scholars were outstandingly successful is referenced continually as a part of the story of UMBC. When you look at Catholica in Chile, you'll see they have a story that they tell about being a religious institution, but one that serves a state that they did not always support politically. And they talk about how they managed to keep their values and vision even in adverse circumstances. And they have a clear story about how they did that. Again, this is part of communicating what the institution stands for. And when we talk with people about what the institution stands for, you get the same message. And so that the value set is shared and celebrated internally. And when visiting institutions, we would always look for what is featured when you go into the institution. What is the first thing you see at the entry point? Is it do they showcase the celebration of the basketball team that won March Madness in 2018 or whatever it was? No, they actually celebrate the chess team because it's had 10 victories and the basketball team has only had one. Or you do this to see that there is a consistency between what you're told and what the institution displays as what it cares about. The other reason that you talk about, you want to have these institutions have a clear message about what they do, is to make their message accessible to the wider community. Because the wider community is what supports these institutions. Many of them are public institutions or are dependent upon public support in some way, be it tax abatement, tax relief, regulation, the ability to operate a particular way. But you need to be able to have the support from the wider community for that. And particularly as political volatility is not unknown in some of the environments in which we've been working. Matt talked about the average life of the term in office of a university president in the United States being 6.5 years. The average term of office of an education minister is probably 1/3 of that. And so if you're dependent upon political support, you can't depend on it coming from the same person all of the time. So you have to have support from a wider community. And being able to communicate about what you stand for in an accessible and meaningful way, and to do so consistently, is one way to ensure you get that support from the wider community. So consistency of purpose, consistency in communication, in messaging, are fundamental lessons that we've learned from these cases. If you're going to be excellent, you have to have a clear message about what you're going to be excellent in. What is it that you're trying to achieve? And one more, I think, Matt, before this is what we see in all of the cases, is that there is a strong institutional or organizational culture. And almost always the very first thing is that there is a strong commitment to the students. And I laughed because I'd forgotten about the UMBC quote about the quirky students. Almost exactly the same phrase is used to describe the students at the School of Advanced Studies in Tumen. We have the woman in charge of student life. We have some very different students here. There are people who are pursuing particular educational missions or life missions, or people who've got different forms of belief and different approaches to sexuality and identity. You'll see exactly the same conversation with the president of the Tata Institute. She talks about students who are coping with gender fluidity and the multiplicities of faiths and beliefs that make up the Indian culture. So understanding and supporting and challenging your students is something that we see consistently in these institutions. They all have their own approach to academic excellence. They're not necessarily saying that we're going to produce the world's greatest scientists and the world's most productive researchers, but they talk about setting and maintaining high standards. And they also talk about being innovative in their academic environment. I talked about the commitment to the field projects, the field work at Tata. You talk to the people at the Tumen University at the School of Advanced Studies. It's a liberal arts institution in a public system in Russia, where liberal arts is not the main message of the day, shall we say. So these are institutions that are innovative in their own ways. At the same time, all of these are institutions that, while they're committed to excellence that are understandable by international norms and standards, they're also struggling to maintain relevance in serving the local community. And we talk about the domestic relevance, because they all are part of an ecosystem or an enabling environment that has particular purposes, priorities, and values. And as I said, many of them are dependent upon support from the state or from local communities who are paying tuition. None of these institutions are drawing upon a deep endowment that will sustain them for years to come. So they have to maintain their relevance. I was reminded that when I asked the head of the Tata Institute and she's been there since a junior faculty member. She's in her 35th year and has just been appointed as president. What do you say to the young faculty? And she says, I tell them that I ask them if they want to be amongst those people who made a difference. Do you want to be counted amongst those who've made a difference in the life of the community? And that is her way of saying, you've got to work out how to prepare students who are able to make a difference in the life of the poorest in India. The final thing is that they've got a commitment to continually improving. None of these institutions are standing still. The clock has not stopped. They aren't declaring victory and leaving the field. They're all saying we need to get better at this. We need to get better at that. Freeman was worried that he was losing 12% in the first year, an unacceptably high loss rate, and 25% by the second year is too much. So he's looking for ways to do that. And finally, there is a continued belief in the wider purpose of their institution. It's not just to educate people for a good job. It's a belief that they want to make a difference in some larger social or political or policy environment. And those four commitments, as we talk about, are recurring elements in the cultures of the institutions that we're talking about. Now, what's missing from the things that we've learned is there is not much in most of these cases that we look at. There is not an obsession with research outcome and research productivity. There are some institutions where that matters and they talk about it, but it doesn't make it into the top four. And there are one or two exceptions in the cases that we talk about, but by and large, they're not as concerned about publications and research as most institutions that we deal with in our day-to-day lives. Finally, I think there's one more slide, if I remember correctly. And that's the sort of summary of what we think will be in the final write-up of looking across the cases, is that we encourage people to judge universities not so much on metrics, on reputation or research productivity or the efficiency with which they use their endowment, but to judge them on how well they achieve their mission or purpose. The second thing that we've learned is that what we talk about is hyper-concentration, is that if you take 40% of your nation's higher education budget and spend it on 10% of the system, 10% of all of the institutions, it's not useful for the majority of the population, and it's not useful for creating a culture of institutional improvement. It actually encourages complacency. And so the notion of exploring world-class universities, we think doesn't lift the quality of education across the nation or across the region. And the third thing to repeat is that consistency, communication, and culture are the key drivers that produce institutional excellence. Consistency of mission, consistency of leadership, consistency of values. And communicating consistently about those things helps you show that you have a powerful culture. And I think that's the takeaways. Thank you. Margaret, it's back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I have here some of the questions, and I'm going to raise them one at a time with you. Thank you. One of them, Alan, relates to just what you were talking about. And that is, the question is, how does the concept of excellence in higher education link to specific national cultural values, factors?
It's interesting. One of the things that has influenced how we talk about this idea of excellence is an essay by Amartya Sen, in which Sen he talks about how culture matters.
Yes.
And in all of these cases, the culture of the surrounding culture is shaping the mission of the institution, because we talk about domestic relevance. But it's also, from time to time, trying to bump the institution off its mission, because political priorities change, prevailing circumstances change. The enabling environment, as some people call it, is influenced by a natural disaster, a collapse in the currency, somebody starting a war on your borders. They're all influencing the day-to-day existence of institutions. And the challenge for all of the institutions in our cases is, how do I maintain that consistency that we value so highly? How do I continue to focus on academic excellence when someone wants me to deal with issues of mental health and isolation? And so how do I respond? Because you can't just dismiss it, because this is part of the political environment which you're operating in. But how do you respond and continue your purpose? So there is a tension. And one of the ways you manage that is by go back to the notion that you've communicated clearly what your purpose is, and you've established support in the wider community for operating in a particular way. And when someone is asking you to change that by taking on a new mission or a new purpose, you're able to say, well, look, we can accommodate you this way, but our key mission has to stay this. Otherwise, we're not going to be successful. We're not going to be responsive to the overarching goal of being great at social science, the liberal arts, technology, education, whatever. So there is always a tension between political change, culture, and the institute, and what makes an organisation so successful, which is consistency of purpose. I don't know, Matt, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's fascinating about these institutions is that many of them really are, in many respects, trying to achieve or advance an ideal that really, in some respects, pushes against predominant norms. And so I think we saw that in the UMBC case, where it was like, hey, listen, we're a science-focused institution. We have to weed students out. And part of the pushing back was saying, no, actually, what we need to do is change who we are so that all students can be successful. You know, that was sort of a pushing back. And I think we see this in some of the other institutions too. You know, for instance, Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan was established in order to show what it could be like if there was an institution that was completely autonomous, that was not beholden to the Ministry of Education, and that could make whatever innovations it wanted to without asking for permission, and would have complete control over its curriculum and the programs that it offered and so forth. I mean, that was a radical change at the time. And that was what the intent of creating the institution was, is to push against a society that had a very centralized system of higher education, where the Ministry of Education, prior to, I think it was 2018, Alan, dictated 75% of the undergraduate curriculum for all universities in that country. And so here you have an institution that can do everything that it wants to on its own. That was a radical shift. Or you look at Asian University for Women, which is essentially providing an outstanding liberal arts education to young women in a part of the world where the education of women is often not valued, and and even for some quite impoverished populations in that region. So some of these institutions are doing very interesting things because they're really asking themselves, what is the way the world should be? How should we act in a way that would enable us to live out what it would look like if we were if the world were a little bit different and a little bit better?
Good, thank you. Okay, I have another question here. It says, does accreditation or some other form of quality assurance have any role in excellence of universities in the countries that you have reviewed? And if so, what is that role?
Well, so as someone who's foreign by birth to the United States, I have to say US accreditation leaves me completely mystified. Now, let's go to the heart of the question, which is that Matt has just talked about an institution that is not accredited by its national authorities, which is the Nazarbayev University, and is, however, is it going through the process of accrediting its its programs and schools with international accreditors? Because if you're an engineering school, CBET, Council of something or other engineering, the international standard is actually a professional standard. And so for them, being hallmarked or accredited by the internationally recognized professional body is more important than national accreditation. Some of the other institutions, the School of Advanced Studies in India, they got accredited by the Russian ministry. The Russian ministry did not know what they were looking at. And it was very clear that the accreditation standards used by the ministry and what the institution was doing were just really hard to align. But they sat down and worked out how to say, this is what we do and this is how it fits with your standards. And in most cases, accreditation is not a force for improvement. Accreditation is a force for compliance. Now, you can tell I'm not a big fan of accreditation because I don't think it drives improvement of institutions. It doesn't say, how can you make your culture better? It says, this is the standard that we think you want to be recognized as operating to meet the minimum standards for the state, for the nation, the like. It doesn't say you can do better. Now, Matt has, for his sins, and has been on the accreditation process for the University of Pennsylvania. And yes, the processes of self-study and reflection do encourage you to be better. But it's national accreditation doesn't necessarily do that. So, Matt, you have a much more balanced view about this than me.
No, I think you hit the nail right on the head, Alan. The only thing I would say to add to this, which very much follows on what you're saying, is that the bar that these institutions are holding up is infinitely higher than the accreditation bar. Mm-hmm. These institutions are really striving to do remarkable work in the world. And if you look at what most of the standards are for general accreditation, it's around things like mission and having sort of clear operational procedures and things that these institutions would sail over those bars without any problem. So I think to directly answer the question, I don't see accreditation as playing a particular role in shaping these institutions because they're reaching much higher.
Okay, thank you. Now I have another question. And this is after having listened to you on this and the importance of continuity and that sort of thing. This question is, in the pursuit of current and future excellence, what are some strategies to consider to recruit and attain talents for higher education industry, both in the faculty and in the staff?
So if I knew the answer to that, I'd be rich.
Oh, okay.
But I think that one of the things, though, that Alan, and you spoke to this, I think one of the things that's so wonderful about these cases is that in most of these institutions that we pointed to, there are people who have been at these institutions for long periods of time. And the reason why they've been there for long periods of time is that they believe in what the institution is doing. And so, as Alan laid out, these are institutions that are clear about the difference they're trying to make in the world. And as they recruit faculty, that's part of what the recruitment is. This is the work that we're doing. Come join us. And for certain people, that's enormously attractive. You know, be part of something brand new. And a couple of the institutions in our set were brand new institutions. Nazarbayev University, Asian University for Women. And, these were institutions that had to attract people that were already at sort of established institutions and basically say, hey, come take a chance and join us on this whole new venture. And yet they were able to do it because of the vision that they had of what they were trying to do in their particular contexts. And I think that's one of the lessons that leads to learn in terms of attracting talent, is being clear about what it is you're trying to do.
So Matt's right to remind me that, I was just talking to you about consistency and communicating what you stand for. If President of Arizona State, Michael Crow, tells the story about recruiting a relatively junior faculty member, and he came very highly recommended. He had a really good research team and to come with him, and he was very productive. And Michael interviewed him and said, well, how are you going to feel about teaching undergraduate chemistry? And this guy's like, well, I think that'd just be a terrible waste of my time. So Michael said, well, that's really interesting. I hope you find a job somewhere. And closed the door, because Arizona and Michael Crow was committed to the best possible teaching, particularly in the sciences and particularly in chemistry, which this guy was his field, because there was no value continuity. So if you're going to build a consistent leadership message or a consistent leadership team, you are saying, this is what we stand for. Yes, we'll listen to you if you've got other values that you want to promote. And yes, we'll test them, but this is what we stand for. Don't come here if you're not comfortable with us. And in fact, we will think you'd just be unhappy and so on. So it goes back to having a consistent message about what your purpose is and what your values are. And that way you say, this is what we stand for. Come to us. If you want to come here, this is what we care about. And that's too often, people say, well, what's your Scopus ranking? Or what do you think about this? Whereas if the hiring process needs to look at fit with the culture of the institution. And I suppose that's the message. And that's just another way of saying what Matt's saying. Next question, Margaret.
Next question. Can you give us a sense of how national culture really changes the goal and mission of universities in different countries? And what differences have you seen in goals and mission looking around at universities around the world?
So sounds like a graduate seminar that would take a couple of days, but you do see. I mean, if you look at if you look at the world-class university strategies that the Chinese government is pursuing and has been pursuing since 1985 or 95, I forget which. And they talk in the most recent iteration, what they call the double first program, that they want to build universities that are excellent in promoting moral values and Chinese characteristics and a belief in the party and the state. It's explicit. And that's different to what you might find in other environments. If we had a spirited conversation some years back with one of the leaders of an Algerian university who tried to convince us that every university in Algiers had the same standard because there was a commitment to equal opportunity for every community in Algeria. And he held this point of view very passionately. And I said to him, that's terrific. I appreciate it. Now, tell me which university is the best in Algeria. Oh, mine is better than everybody else's. So that sometimes, so what I'm trying to say with that reference is that even when the national values are for equal funding, equal admission standards, equal salary, equal compensation for every member of faculty, institutional difference still emerges. And so just because there's a strong prevailing culture in the political system or in the national identity, the institutions don't always align completely with that. But I can't speak for all of the nations of the world, but in most cases there is some element of national culture that's reflected in institutions. US institutions are, as an outsider, I still get astonished at how much choice students have and how much choice faculty have in what they do, how much choice staff have in what they do and what they believe and what they pursue. In other nations, there is much, much less choice about what you do and what you study, and the opportunity to specialize being deferred later on. So, some of these are accidents of history. Some of them are products of culture. Some are shaped by the nature of secondary schooling. So, enough. Sorry, it's an interesting topic, but well beyond our limited research.
I see.
The one thing I would say, Margaret, is I do think that one of the things that comes out in each of the profiles is the way in which the national context does matter. And it certainly matters to the stories of these institutions and how they've evolved in really quite interesting ways. And sometimes it's I'm thinking, for instance, again, with Asian University for Women, this idea of providing, young women with an outstanding liberal arts education is one thing. That's radical enough. But at Asian University for Women, they're actually bringing in the daughters from the garment worker factories. They are garment workers' daughters from the factories coming to learn at this institution alongside the daughters of the owners of those factories. That's a pretty, so that shapes a lot of how people think about how do we sort of shape, how do we bring students in? How do we orient them? How do we help them understand that we're all here part of a learning community? That particular environment is something that has to be dealt with and addressed by the institution itself, because the particular context is one in which they have to, adapt their work to fit that, particular context.
True.
And I think that we've seen that at each institution. There are ways in which that happens, and it comes out in somewhat different ways in each of the cases.
Excellent. Now, we have exactly, looking at it, 1 minute. I do have one last question, and it's rather lengthy. I'm curious in the presenter's thoughts about commercial diplomacy and how universities can contribute to the sphere of activity, or maybe what they should do to enhance national strategic interests through commercial diplomacy? That's what someone asked.
Well, the commercialization of intellectual knowledge, of knowledge, is not necessarily something that some of our institutions care about. I mean, that commercialization of knowledge piece, which is interesting, and yes, it's a key feature of some higher education systems, doesn't necessarily align with the purposes of institutions that are committed to teaching and preparing people to be school teachers or social workers. So, I think it relates to a small section of the university systems around the world, and it's really not aligned with the notions of excellence that we're really interested in studying. I mean, that would be my take.
I see. Okay. Well, we have now reached 1 p.m. here. I want to thank both of you very, very much for an excellent presentation. I'm very anxious to see your book. You have a book coming out?
We do. Well, we have one that we're delivering to the press in 3 months.
In 3 months. Well, I will be getting that book, I promise you, because your knowledge of this field is really wonderful to tap into. So thank you very much. Anything you'd like to tell me as you go?
Just thank you so much for the invitation. It was just a delight to be here.
Yeah. Thanks for all the work that Berkeley does at promoting international higher ed. It matters a lot to us.
Yes. Okay. Goodbye. And
Bye.
thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.